Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us to tell you about the 2021 round of Livable Communities Demonstration Account, or LCDA, and Transit-Oriented Development, or TOD, grants. Today, we're going to start by giving a brief overview of what the Livable Communities Act, or LCA, is, tell you where you can find out about the two LCA programs we are not going to cover today, the Tax-Based Revitalization Account and Local Housing Incentives Account. Then we will focus on the LCDA and TOD programs, sharing with you the evaluation work we undertook in 2020 and what you need to know about LCDA and TOD for 2021. We know that a lot of folks here are familiar with LCA, but we also know that a lot of folks are not. So very briefly, the LCA is a state statute passed in 1995 that created a grant program for the 7-county metro. The program is voluntary, and participating cities can apply for competitive grants for development and redevelopment projects that create and preserve a full range of housing choices across the region, create and preserve living wage jobs throughout the region, and finally, demonstrate compact, efficient, and interconnected development. And the key phrase in all that is that participating cities can apply. So only cities can apply for these programs, that they partner closely with developers and other development team members for the application process. Each of the 4 grant programs in LCA has a different focus and a different program manager. The TBRA program provides brownfield investigation and cleanup and is managed by Marcus Martin. The LHIA program is specifically for the creation and preservation of affordable housing and is managed by Ashley Johnson. The LCDA program supports a variety of development projects that meet LCA goals and is managed by Hannah Gary. And finally, the TOD program supports development projects with high-frequency transit stations and is managed by Stephen Klimek. As I mentioned, we are focusing on the LCDA and TOD programs today, but I wanted to quickly share basic info about TBRA and LHIA as well, and where to find more information about both. These slides have links to webinars about those programs. Well, there's some basic information about the Tax-Based Revitalization Account and seeding equitable environmental development on this slide, as well as a link to a webinar with more information about this program and other brownfield remediation programs in the region. LHIA, or Local Housing Incentives Account, is offered once a year and is pooled with other affordable housing resources in Minnesota Housing's consolidated request for proposals. Developers can apply for LHIA through the consolidated RFP, but the city must agree to be the official grant recipient per statute. As I mentioned before, for all other LCA programs, only participating cities or county development authorities can be applicants. For more info about this year's LHIA process, contact Ashley Johnson or watch the linked webinar from Minnesota Housing you see on this slide. Okay, that's it for basics. Now we're going to dive into the results of the LCDA and TOD evaluation work that the team undertook in 2020. For those of you that don't know, I'm only the 3rd manager of LCA since 1995, and I've only been LCA manager for a little over a year. The current council is also relatively new, and much of the LCA team is new too. So doing a deep dive into the LCDA and TOD programs has been really valuable to better understand the purpose of these grants, be able to communicate about them clearly, and think about the future of the programs and the impact we'd like to have. This slide summarizes the evaluation activities we undertook in 2020. We had dozens of conversations, including focus groups organized by Metro Cities, the Council's Land Use Advisory Committee, a subgroup of the Council's Community Development Committee, and many one-on-ones with developers, city staff, and other community development stakeholders. We also put out a survey to better understand communication and program material needs. Next, we looked back at our own data to better understand who has been participating most in the program and who has been less engaged. Finally, we did our own analysis of the LCDA and TOD scoring criteria, looking at how it aligned with the statutory purpose of LCA and the Regional Development Guide, Thrive MSP, which is also referenced in statute to give policy direction to the programs. So what did we learn? Well, in our outreach and engagement, we heard that some communities, especially those with more traditionally suburban and rural development patterns, didn't feel like they were able to be competitive in the programs. Similarly, smaller communities with fewer staff capacity also felt like the application process was a barrier to applying. We also heard that folks weren't always clear about what the scoring criteria valued, and some criteria felt subjective, making it hard to know if a project would score well. The former innovation and demonstration value criteria were particularly called out as hard to understand and a barrier to apply. The data analysis we did seemed to support the first part of that feedback, related to who is accessing the program. This chart shows the share of all applications received by communities, using the Thrive community designations, but grouping them even further and pulling out Minneapolis and St. Paul. For those of you not familiar with community designations, urban and urban center communities represent the first and most second-ring suburbs and tend to have more urban development patterns. The suburban communities are some of the second and third-ring suburbs and are usually more developed, and the suburban and emerging suburban edge communities are third and fourth-ring suburbs that still have plenty of green fields to develop. The numbers next to each designation grouping represent the number of LCA participants that could have applied each year from those community designations. So it's not a big surprise that a big share of the applications are coming from Minneapolis and St. Paul. And below, you can see that the urban and urban center communities are the next highest share of applications. But we wanted to take a look at the chart if we didn't include the central cities too. With this closer look, we see that rural centers have not been applying at all in quite some time, despite having 11 rural center communities participating in LCA in the 2010 decade. Urban and urban center communities are showing a pretty consistent share of applications at around 20% of all eligible applicants, or 20% of all applications. And suburban edge communities appear to average just around 5 to 10% of applications in a given year. However, these charts are showing the shares of total applications, so it includes duplicates from the same city. We also wanted to look at just how many participants by these community types applied at all. This chart provides more insight, showing us that while around 40% of urban and urban center participants are applying in a typical year, suburban and suburban edge participants rarely apply at rates higher than 20%. So this seems to correlate with what we were hearing, that the program is not feeling accessible to smaller and more traditionally suburban communities. The last part of our evaluation work in 2020 was to analyze how the scoring criteria aligned with the foundational purpose of LCA, which again includes language to also use Thrive outcomes to prioritize projects. Interestingly, we found that the criteria most often characterized as subjective or unclear, and there are examples of these criteria in the blue hexagons, didn't really have a discernible basis in statute or Thrive. While innovation is a really positive thing, it's not the intent of the program as described in statute. Similarly, while D in LCDA is demonstration, the idea that projects should demonstrate something unique or new, which is how that has been interpreted, is not actually the way it's described in statute. Rather, the LCDA, or Demonstration Account Program, is meant to support projects that demonstrate those foundational LCA goals of housing, jobs, and compact connected development. We found other criteria that weren't supported by statute or Thrive as well. LCDA and TOD have been evaluated for catalytic potential in the past, but this is not referenced in the statute. And in practice, we find that development momentum is influenced by many things outside our particular grant program or any individual development project's control. We are also increasingly aware that catalytic growth can sometimes indicate unintended consequences like displacement. Readiness is another past scoring criteria that isn't found in the statute. That doesn't mean it's not very reasonable to evaluate projects that actually have a good chance of being built, and that is connected to the Thrive outcome of stewardship, using public funding wisely and effectively. But when we looked back, we found no correlation between how projects scored for readiness, using, among others, the criteria in the hexagon on the left, and how likely they were to actually be built versus relinquishing or turning back the grant. Furthermore, we heard from scorers that evaluating readiness from a financial perspective was often a guessing game, even for finance experts. It's very difficult to look at 3 projects all planning to apply for low-income housing tax credits, for example, and guess which is more likely to get those tax credits. We found that the local government's investment in the project, financial and political, and the quality of the partnership between the development team and the city is a much better indicator of project success. And you'll see that reflected in the 2021 scoring and program details that Hannah and Stephen will soon be sharing with you. But next, I'm going to turn it over to Hannah, and she's going to talk about our website and then some of the other details about the LCDA and TOD programs for 2021.
So as Tara mentioned, part of our evaluation process was to review our communication materials. And we do have a new website and program materials for this year. We encourage everyone to explore the new website and the new resource library, and to reach out if you have any questions about where any of the information is located on the website. And I'll now pass it over to Stephen to talk about the 2021 schedule.
LCDA and TOD have two main types of grants, pre-development and development. We will be talking about each and their differences in more detail throughout the rest of the presentation. Pre-development grants are hosted twice this year. Applications for LCDA and TOD are due on April 21st and on July 21st. April 21st applications funding decisions are expected in June, and the July application funding decisions are expected in September. TOD development and LCDA development have different deadlines this year, and they happen later in the year than in years past. TOD applications for development are due on September 7th with a December funding decision, and LCDA development applications are due on September 27th with an expected January funding decision. This year's development grant deadlines are later than in previous years. This will provide prospective applicants more time to consider applying, to respond to this year's criteria, and to prepare applications. Pre-development grants occur in 2 rounds, but deadlines for both are earlier than in previous years, and both take place before development grants. This will enable LCA to carry over any and all remaining funding from pre-development into the development grants, so we can maximize each program's allocated funding in a given year and make sure more funding can go into community development projects. All applications will open at least 1 month before the deadline. And for the next section of the presentation, we're going to walk through LCDA and TOD programs together. While they have many similarities, the key differences between the two are TOD's eligible areas along transit routes, as well as additional TOD scoring criteria. And now I'll hand it off to Hannah to share more details on the pre-development program.
Thanks, Stephen. So we're gonna go over more of these program changes in detail in upcoming slides. But for now, I'll just talk a little bit about changes that we have made for the program in 2021. So we're hoping to support projects earlier on in the development process. And this year we have doubled the amount of money in pre-development programs, going from $250,000 per round up to $500,000 per round. Additionally, we've also changed the per city limit from $100,000 to $150,000. In response to COVID, we are going to be offering the possibility of 1-year extensions for projects that have been impacted by COVID. And for TOD projects, the TOD eligible areas for ridership will be based on 2020 numbers rather than 2021 numbers. You can find all of the TOD eligible areas on the LCA website by looking at the map or by entering your project address into our Make a Map function. The match percent has stayed the same. We know that some of you have had questions about how that match is calculated, and we actually have a link to a match calculator on the website. And this is how we'll calculate the match too. And there are instructions on the website on how to use that calculator. Again, like Stephen mentioned, the applications are due on April 21st and July 21st, and applications open about 1 month before they're due. And just a quick note about the applications themselves. In doing our evaluation process, we heard that we had some of the most difficult applications. Painful and arduous came up fairly often when we were talking to applicants and developers. So the applications this year are going to be much shorter. And we also are going to be providing data profiles to each applicant to help answer specific questions as much as possible. And this will be true both for pre-development and development. And I'll now pass it over to Stephen to talk about eligible activities for pre-development.
Thanks, Hannah. Pre-development grants eligible activities can support a wide variety of project costs. These include what studies, designs, or reports are needed to support your future development project, as well as how you are working and who you are working with. The slide's a brief overview of eligible activities for pre-development. Of note for this year, environmental sustainability and planning. This can now include project-specific or district-wide stormwater management plans, as well as district-wide heating and cooling or waste management plans. It can also include passive building design, concept planning. Site planning and design can include landscape plans that will conserve natural resources and increase green space. It can include the development of public realm plans for a project or the development of outdoor recreation plans for affordable housing projects. And can also include additional design work to have universal design features beyond local requirements. A whole new category is affordable housing capital assessments, focused on supporting physical or capital needs and energy audits for the rehab of affordable housing units or buildings. Financial modeling, including feasibility or market studies. TOD zoning ordinances are its own sub-grant category in pre-development. And a range of equitable development strategies, including design workshops and community engagement. And these can support more components of equitable and authentic engagement activities that center those least represented and most impacted by historic racial inequities. Community benefit agreements, efforts to understand the history of discrimination and land ownership in and around your project site, and using that information to inform your future development. And other project studies, including health impacts, displacement risk, mitigation, and equity impacts. Generally, LCDA and TOD grants cannot support work that was done before the grant was awarded, or soft costs which are not directly related to an awarded grant activity. We encourage you to check the LCA website for a full list of both eligible as well as ineligible activities, and please reach out early to Hannah or myself as program officers to discuss the details of your projects and what we can try to support in that work. With that outline, Hannah's going to talk more about pre-development application scoring criteria.
So Stephen introduced the what, the how, and the who in eligible activities, and we've restructured our scoring this year in the same way. We're still focusing on the same key principles of the program, but have just organized the scoring in a new way. For pre-development, we're going to be looking at proposed project outcomes, proposed pre-development activity outcomes, project process, and project team. Proposed project outcomes is assessing how well your proposed project is going to meet LCA goals. For example, are you hoping to build housing or rehab affordable housing or create living wage jobs? So this portion will assess how well your project goals are aligned with LCA goals. The pre-development activities section is looking at how well those requested activities are going to help push your project forward and meet LCA goals and to achieve more equitable outcomes. The how and the who are similar to what we had previously for partnerships and process and readiness. So the how of the project is looking at your project process, and in that we're including community engagement and understanding the history and development context of your project site. We are going to be looking to see how those least represented and most impacted are being centered in your process and how those participants have agency, as well as who benefits from the project. In assessing the proposed project team, we're looking to see if the project team is reflective of those being served by the project, the plan for the project team to work together, and if the grant can be used in 2 years. And this is taking place of the former readiness category. We had to look more at capacity rather than readiness. The pre-development grants are scored by a review panel made up of CD staff. And while the scoring categories for LCDA and TOD are really similar, you'll notice that TOD places more of an emphasis on transportation options in the station area and transit connections. And you'll see that this differentiation is true both for pre-development and for development. So now Stephen is going to talk us through the beginning of the development grant programs.
Thank you, Hannah. So we're going to transition to talking about the LCDA and TOD development grants. This is a category geared towards projects that are farther along in their process, are likely ready for construction, and have actual activities and construction capital costs that can be supported through our grants. The main changes to development for 2021 from last year and previous years is that projects will no longer be scored on innovation, demonstration, or catalytic value. The full scoring tables are online, have more details on all of these. The new scoring tables focus on project outcomes, project process, and the project team. This is the what, how, and who. I'll touch more on these as they relate to development. Projects need to meet a minimum equity score to be eligible for funding, in addition to a minimum overall score. And housing performance scores are no longer included in our project scoring. As a response to COVID-19 impacts on ridership and service levels, TOD eligible areas are remaining the same as 2020 pre-COVID service levels, including the Blue Line extension. The amount of funding available in each program remains relatively the same as previous years. LCDA has $9 million available and TOD has $4 million available. And again, any funding that is not awarded in the first or second round of our pre-development programs will be available to the development programs. There is no match required for development applications. And again, the key dates are later in the year than in the past. TOD applications are due September 7th, and LCDA applications are due September 27th. And as outlined for pre-development, we hope the actual applications for development grants will be much shorter, and we will also be providing data profiles to each applicant based on their project's location to help answer questions in more detail. And Hannah now is going to talk to us about the development scoring criteria.
So first we're going to do eligible activities and then jump into the scoring criteria. So for the development programs, I really encourage everyone to go to the LCA website to see a full list of eligible and ineligible activities. There are quite a few eligible activities listed out for the development program. But this year we wanted to highlight some new eligible activities. So the biggest change this year is the addition of rehab and preservation of affordable housing. And this includes exterior improvements for energy efficiency or to bring the building up to code, interior improvements, and improvements to common areas, both indoors and outdoors. And for rehab funding, the units need to be affordable at 60% of AMI for a minimum of 15 years. And in mixed income buildings, all of the units should be identical and distributed throughout the building. And if the building is mixed income, we will prorate the costs to the portion of affordable units. So for example, if you have 50% of the units in the building that are income restricted affordable units, we can support 50% of the rehab costs. And this stipulation actually applies to all activities that are listed as only eligible for affordable housing. In addition to supporting preservation and rehab, we're also expanding eligibility to support affordable housing projects. For example, broadband internet connections and playgrounds are eligible expenses for affordable housing projects this year. And we won't go through each of the eligible activities for 2021 because the list is pretty long. But again, I just encourage you to look through the list on the website and reach out to either Stephen or me if you have any questions. And then we'll go into an overview of some of the ineligible activities that we have for development. So again, this is just a sample list of ineligible activities, and a complete list is available on the LCA website. One change we did want to highlight is that solar is no longer eligible through the development program for either LCDA or TOD. And we do have resources for additional solar funding on the LCA website, and we would be more than happy to connect you with our solar expert at the council. So now Stephen is going to go over the scoring criteria for the development program.
Again, we have restructured our scoring criteria this year, but we are still focusing on the same key principles of the program. In LCDA and TOD development grants, we're evaluating projects in 3 key categories: the what of a project, its outcomes; the how of a project, its process; and the who of a project, its team. The what of your proposed project outcomes is assessing how well your proposed project will meet LCA goals, specifically housing and affordability, jobs and living wage opportunities, compact connected development, environmental sustainability, and livability. The how of your proposed project process is looking at the ways in which you are planning and will continue to design your project, including community engagement, as well as understanding the historic development context of your project site. We're specifically looking to see how those least represented and most impacted are being centered in your process and who will ultimately benefit from your project. The who of your proposed project team is assessing who has been assembled as the project team, We're looking to see if the team is reflective of those being served by the project, plans for the project team to work together, and if the grant can be used in the 3-year term. This year's application will include an optional narrative to expand on any part of your project that isn't captured in the questions of the categories. LCDA and TOD development applications will still be scored in 2 steps. The step 1 review is done by a team of Metropolitan Council staff. Projects need to meet a minimum overall score in step 1 review to advance to the next round, as well as meet a minimum equity score, which we're going to touch on in a minute. The second review step is conducted by the Livable Communities Advisory Committee, or LCAC, and this 15-member external review panel will make the final funding recommendation to the council. And with that, Tara now is going to talk to us more specifically about that equity scoring criteria.
Thanks, Stephen. So I'm guessing that a lot of you listening maybe perked your ears up when you heard Stephen mention that there's going to be a minimum score related to the equity-derived criteria in the step 1 review process. And so I wanted to take a moment to step back and walk folks through what we're talking about when we say equity criteria, and just reassure folks that we've spent a lot of time really working to develop equity criteria that we think is measurable, that is reasonably able to be achieved by any type of community in the region, and that can help us all further equitable outcomes in the region. So again, referring to that structure that we have been using for scoring, or we are using for our scoring criteria of the what, how, and the who, there is equity criteria in the step 1 scoring for all 3 of those sections for 2021. In the what category, we're looking specifically for how aspects of the project or the project location or the developer or the applicant, meaning the city, are proactively attempting to reduce racial disparities. And since most projects are either housing or jobs or a combination of the two, we'll be providing folks with a consideration of a variety of different ways to achieve those points. So for example, a fair housing marketing plan is often required of projects that receive federal or state funding for affordable housing. And the minimum requirement for a fair housing marketing plan would be to identify one underserved community and connect with a organization that can help them market the affordable units to that community. One of the ways you could achieve the project outcomes, or what points for a housing project, would be to go above that minimum and either identify more than one community that is underrepresented in the area, or partner with more than one organization to market to that community. And that's just one example, but we're going to be providing folks with a lot more context for how we evaluate scoring criteria and examples such as the one I just gave you to achieve points in those categories. We're also always available to talk to you specifically about any activities that can achieve those points. In the how section, we are again looking at the process and how the process provides both agency and information and engagement to those who are most impacted and least represented by the project. But that's a criterion that really connects and has a lot of relevance for communities that have a lot of diversity. And so we had to be honest and take a look at the fact that there are communities participating in LCA that are largely represented by white residents. In some communities that participate in LCA, over 90% of their population is white. And so there needs to be ways to address equity even in communities that don't have a lot of diversity. And so one of the ways that we can do that is look at ways that the community is generally trying to address equity. Perhaps they're members of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, or have an Equity or Civil Rights Commission. Those are activities of the participating city that could further equity in that area and could count towards points in that consideration. And this is also another place where some of the fair housing marketing, where inclusiveness and access to a broader range of community members could count towards points in this regard. We'll also offer technical assistance and ways to connect with community members that aren't traditionally represented, that are in the community. Even these communities with more than 90% of residents identifying as white have populations of color that can be reached, and we can help with ideas on how to reach out to them. Finally, in the WHO proposed project team, again, we're looking at the project team being reflective and responsive to the community being served by the project. And that can be, specific experts in a particular field. For example, if a project were proposing to provide housing for folks with physical disabilities, having someone with physical disabilities to consult and provide context for the, design would be one way to get these points. We certainly also in this category would consider lived experience and whether or not members of the project team are representative of the community that they're serving. But again, like all the equity criteria, it's going to be a combination of what are the existing demographics of the area that the project is in, and how is the project responding to those demographics and characteristics in a way that can address racial inequities and other inequities in the region. So just to summarize, because we've been kind of throwing out the term project profiles and the term evaluation guidance for scoring criteria out, I just want to be very clear that project profiles are going to contain a lot of demographic and data about the project site and how that relates to broader regional or city data as well. And that's going to be available to anyone in April who reaches out to us and says, I have a project that we're planning on applying for. Here's the address. I'd like to see that program profile. And we've curated that profile to really help you answer specific questions that are the things we will be evaluating your project on, like the demographics of the surrounding community, for example. But we're also going to be posting on the website, and our goal is March 21st for the pre-development criteria and sometime in April for the development criteria, evaluation guidance that goes into much more detail about each of the scoring criteria, what questions we're asking ourselves when we're scoring for that criteria, and some of the specific ways you can earn points in those sections of the criteria, in those categories. So I want to make sure folks know that those two things will be available and reach out to us at any time. If you haven't reached out for a project profile when you start to complete your application in Web Grants, when you first start the process in Web Grants, we'll see that and we will send you a project profile at that time. Next, I am going to turn it over to Hannah, I believe, to talk in more detail about applying for a grant.
So now that everyone knows a little bit more about the details of the program, we're going to get into how you actually apply. So all applications go through Web Grants, which is our online grant software. And you can access Web Grants through the LCA website by going to the Apply page. And this page also has information about using Web Grants and tips for project teams. And just as a reminder, all applications do need to come from a city, a county, or other development authority like an HRA or an EDA. Developers and community organizations are very strongly encouraged to actively partner on the application, but it does need to come from a government agency. And if you are awarded a grant, the award will go to that government agency that applied rather than it going directly to the developer. Just a reminder about the fair housing policy. So all projects with housing do need to have a locally adopted fair housing policy. And we have resources about this on the LCA resource library, or you can contact Hillary Lovelace, who is our housing planner. So as I mentioned earlier, all applications go through Web Grants, and you only need to request a login if you have never had a Web Grants account before. And the applicant, which again is going to be that city, county, or other development authority, should send a list of everyone who is going to be working on the project before people request logins. And this just really helps the program officers streamline approving the registration requests. If you have had an account in the past, but you've changed roles, you're working in a new job, your email address has changed, you can just update your information in the Web Grants system. And feel free to reach out to either Stephen or me if you don't remember your username, and we can look that up for you. We recommend you read through the tips for project teams that are on that apply page before you start working together. The main thing that we can stress here is to have clear communication from the beginning and an understanding of who will do what in the process. And we also strongly recommend that there is a subrecipient agreement between the government agency and the developer. So like we've said earlier on in the presentation, applications will open in web grants a month before they're due, and we'll put an announcement on our website when applications are open. And as you're working on an application, please do not hesitate to reach out to Stephen or me. We can definitely help you out with any technical trouble that you might experience with web grants. So now I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to talk through our resource library and some of the other technical assistance opportunities we have coming up.
So, as Hannah has mentioned earlier, the LCA website has a new resource library with a number of really great resources, documents, and references intended to help our applicants. These include template resolutions of support and Met Council regional policy documents, as well as external resources in sustainability, transportation, and development. And these touch on all of the key topics that are in our scoring criteria. In addition to the resource library, we're also offering a new technical assistance program this year. These are intended to help applicants develop really competitive applications and adjust to this year's new scoring criteria. And we can move to the next slide. We have more details. This is taking the place of previous year's design workshops. The technical assistance expands on design to include other major components of LCA goals and scoring criteria. And these include project process, equity, environment, and how design strategies ensure the project connects to and addresses the community needs, racial disparities, and sustainability goals. The technical assistance will be broken into 2 parts for each topic, a 1-hour webinar about that topic, and a 3-hour workshop to go deeper into how the topic relates to your project. All of the webinars are free and open to anyone interested. Registration for those will open soon, and more information about the webinars will be available as registration opens. And the workshops are free to any project teams interested, but require project teams to fill out a brief application. You can choose to participate in 1 or more of the workshops, and the information for those is posted on both the LCDA and the TOD program pages at the bottom of their pages under technical assistance. And workshop applications are due by Friday, March 26th. And if you have any questions on the technical assistance, please get in touch with me or Hannah. And now Hannah is going to talk about next steps.
So now that you have all of the information about the programs and how to apply, what comes next? We recommend that you talk with a program officer, so that would be either Stephen or me, early on in the process if you are interested in applying. And we are happy to talk through your project with you, talk about fit with the program. And we are still working remotely, so email is definitely the best way to get in touch with us. And for developers and community organizations, we recommend talking with the city staff where your project is located early on. If you have any questions about who to contact at the city, Stephen or I can help connect you to someone. And if the city that you're interested in partnering with is not a participating community, again, reach out to the city about your interest in applying, and the city can then reach out to us to learn more about re-enrolling. And re-enrolling in the program can happen every year. And finally, just another plug for the upcoming technical assistance sessions. Even if you don't have a project or you don't want to apply to the workshops, the panel sessions will be open to everyone, and we really hope that you'll consider joining in on one or all of them. So that's everything that we had for the presentation today. We do have a few questions to go through, so we will go ahead and do that now. So the first question that we have is, can the match be cash or in kind for pre-development programs? And for that one, the match is only required for pre-development, and it can be cash or in kind. And like we mentioned earlier, there is a grant match calculator available on the website to calculate the match amount. And you can do that by selecting one of the 25% match options and then entering in the funding amount. So the next question that we have is, does the scoring criteria take into account cooperative ownership, like resident ownership of a multifamily building?
So I can take that one, and the answer is yes. One of the things we look for in terms of housing projects is for a housing type that diversifies the housing choices available. And cooperative home ownership is certainly exists across the region, but it is not ubiquitous across the region, and it does provide often a unique model for affordable home ownership that we would certainly value in our current scoring system. So as most things, the devil is somewhat in the details, and it depends on other factors of the application, but there's certainly ways that a cooperatively owned residential project could score well in this program.
So the next question that we have is development funding eligible for manufactured housing under rehab and preservation of affordable housing?
And the answer to that one is technically yes, we would absolutely look at a project, but that is not a common request or application. And so I think there may be some kind of program design features that would potentially make a project like that not score competitively. But again, it somewhat depends. We're also familiar with other programs, including our LHIA program and Minnesota housing programs, that may be a better fit. So if you have a specific question about specific activities for preservation of a manufactured housing community, please let us know, and we can look into that with you.
So this one is a question that we get fairly often. Does affordable housing mean legally binded affordable housing, or can it include naturally occurring affordable housing? And with affordable housing in the LCA program, to be considered affordable housing, it does need to have a legal mechanism keeping the units affordable at 60% of AMI for a minimum of 15 years. So the next question that we have is, I seem to recall prior LCA projects had to be tied to development projects, even when the focus of funding is focused on the development of a public project. Is that true?
So without knowing the particulars of that project, I can say that when we evaluate what we're funding, a development project, any project that it's connected to, we may only be funding for public improvements, but they need to be associated with and directly connected to any features of a development project that allowed for the grant to score well enough to be awarded. So again, without knowing the particulars, it's certainly possible that a development project, for example, mixed use building, could score very well and receive funding for the development of a public plaza or square adjacent to the development. That is certainly possible.
And we have a TOD question here. So is there any consequence for applicants to these programs, specifically TOD, who are also applying for or may receive a Hennepin County TOD grant?
That's a great question. There's no direct outcomes or impacts. We stay in communication between the Hennepin County and other funding programs, and that can help us understand where your project is in its process. But getting or not getting Hennepin County funding, or receiving or not receiving Met Council funding, won't impact your scoring.
So this question is asking about why architecture is exempted from pre-development, because it tends to be a significant pre-development activity for developers and for cities.
So the answer there is that we are really looking to only fund pre-development design activities that go directly toward increasing LCA outcomes. So if they're, for example, stormwater management design, feasibility studies, or some public safe space design, that needs some engagement or design charrette work, we would pay for that to help achieve some of the LCA goals of, connected development. But architecture generally for the building itself is considered a typical project cost and not something that we would fund pre-development funds for.
So this next one is another one that we get fairly often. So based on step 1, how likely is it that commercial only projects can get through? And then I think that means get through to step 2 scoring.
I'm sorry, Hannah, could you repeat that question real quick?
Sure. So based on step 1, how likely is it that commercial only projects can get through to step 2?
Thank you. Yeah, I think this question is related to a change in scoring where in past years we've looked at a project as either a housing project or a jobs project. And depending on which of those categories it scored higher in, we would only look at it through those points. This year, we're looking to go back to a past practice of scoring for housing and jobs in all projects. And so I think the question is maybe getting at the fact that we see often more housing projects than jobs projects. And so will jobs projects still score well when they're being compared against housing projects? And I can tell you that that is certainly not, the intent is certainly to continue to evaluate jobs projects, housing projects, and mixed use projects through through a lens that really kind of, to the best of our ability, looks at the impact and the achievement of LCA goals competitively. And so we very much hope and want to see that jobs projects continue to score well. We also want to make sure that projects get to be scored on all factors of their project. So if there are a lot of jobs and a lot of great affordable housing units in a project, I think we're trying to say that that should score higher than a project that maybe only had some jobs and no housing, given the foundational purpose of the program to further both of those things. However, we did kind of our due diligence and did vet previous projects that only had jobs and not housing units. And we found that those that scored well in the past also scored well in this current scoring system, because, again, the types of jobs, the number of jobs, the location of the jobs, a lot of other factors go into that value. And it's not as simple as sort of one job equals one housing unit. So I will say our intent is to continue to support competitive jobs projects. And we will be making sure that this change doesn't have that unintended consequence of making it harder for jobs projects to do well, and certainly adjust if necessary.
The next question asks if there is an example of a subrecipient agreement on the website. And there is not, but that is a wonderful suggestion, and that is something that we will work on. So the final question that we have is about phased projects. If phased projects can apply and how those projects are scored if they're phased.
So phasing projects are tough. There is, because the answer is they kind of, the other phases kind of matter, and they kind of don't. And the reason for that is that we want to be really careful that we don't favor a project based on future phasing that could and often has fallen through or changed dramatically in the end. So we want a fair competitive process against the singular project we would be funding that year, even if it's a part of a phased development, against other singular developments. On the same vein, there are often features of a phased project that even in its initial phase can kind of impact the outcomes expected because of shared space, shared infrastructure, et cetera. So, we definitely look at the context of the application, and some factors of a phased development could potentially add some points to an evaluation. But generally, we try really hard to make sure we're doing kind of an apples to apples evaluation and only looking at the phase of the project that we would be funding and that our money would go towards making be realized.
Great. Well, those are all of the questions that we had. So thank you everyone for your time. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and we are more than happy to set up a time to talk with you.